the nameless general who humiliated Darius the First. The year is 513 BCE. The most powerful man on earth has just bridged the Bosphorus with ships lashed together end to end and marched an army across it. Herodotus claimed 700,000, though modern historians estimate the true figure at a fraction of that. He has bent the Greek cities into submission. He has built an empire stretching from Egypt to India. And somewhere on this vast, burning, deliberately emptied steppe north of the Danube, a general whose name he will never write down has just broken him completely. Darius the First of Persia launched his Scythian campaign expecting conquest. What he found was silence. The Scythians vanished before him, burning their own grass, poisoning their own wells, and drawing him deeper into a continent with no cities to sack and no army to fight. His supply lines collapsed. His horses starved. After roughly 60 days, he retreated across the Danube and never came back. Persian royal inscriptions at Behistun and Persepolis confirm the campaign happened. They record it as a victory, but they name every king Darius defeated elsewhere, every city he took, every enemy commander he humiliated in the field. For the Scythian campaign, the enemy leadership is simply absent. Historian Askold Ivanchik, studying Scythian royal genealogy through the early 2000s, identified at least 4 distinct tribal commanders active during this period whose names appear in Greek sources but nowhere in Persian records. Herodotus names the Scythian king Edenthersis but attributes the military strategy to a collective council. Someone conceived and executed one of the most sophisticated strategic retreats in ancient history: lure, burn, deny, exhaust, a doctrine so advanced Sun Tzu was theorizing something similar on the other side of the world at roughly the same moment. We have the result. We have zero record of its author. Mainstream historians say Persian royal inscriptions were propaganda. You didn't name enemies who beat you. But Persian records routinely named enemies they defeated. The selective void applies only here, only to this campaign. Some researchers ask whether the namelessness was itself a condition, whether a people who, according to Herodotus, identified their greatest warriors by the skulls they drank from, demanded anonymity as part of whatever agreement ended the confrontation. The general who stopped the world's largest empire left no monument, no inscription, no burial we can identify. Just a retreating army and a silence shaped exactly like a man. Geta and the face hammered out of history. In Rome, in the year 211 CE, somewhere in an imperial workshop, a craftsman is doing something that feels less like art and more like erasure. He has a chisel, he has an order, and he has the entire machinery of an empire behind him. Emperor Caracalla murdered his co-emperor brother Geta in their mother's arms and immediately activated a system that would reach across 3 million square miles. Within hours, coins were being recalled and restruck. Portrait busts were recarved. Military diplomas were reissued. Inscriptions across every province were attacked with chisels. The formal legal mechanism was damnatio memoriae, condemnation of memory, but what followed went far beyond legal procedure. The Severantondo, a circular painted family portrait discovered in Egypt and now housed in the Antikensammlung in Berlin, shows the damage with haunting clarity. Septimius Severus, Julia Domna, and young Caracalla stare outward. Where Geta's face should be, there is a smeared ghost of scraped paint. Art historian Rainer Worland's forensic analysis in 1986 confirmed the damage was immediate, not centuries of degradation. Someone did this while the paint was still relatively fresh. Epigrapher Geza Alfoldi cataloged over 2,000 surviving inscriptions bearing deliberate erasure marks consistent with Geta's condemnation. Historian Jeffrey Sumi, writing in 2005, calculated compliance across public monuments at over 90%. Cassius Dio records that even private citizens were prosecuted for speaking Geta's name. The name itself became a legal hazard. The mainstream explanation is straightforward. Caracalla needed to eliminate a rival claim to the throne. Political erasure of deposed rulers was standard Roman practice. But the obsessive physical violence of these erasures, the deep gouging, the over-chiseling on private portrait busts that no court official would ever inspect, suggests something operating beneath politics. Multiple ancient cultures, from Egypt to Mesopotamia to Rome, shared a documented belief that to destroy a name was to destroy the soul. Was Caracalla performing politics or something older and more total? Some historians ask whether what he ordered was not just censorship, but a second death, an attempt to annihilate a brother not just from the record, but from whatever came after it. From marble streets and iron chisels, we cross the Mediterranean to a civilization that was erasing generals 1,000 years before Caracalla was born. Pa, the Nubian conqueror, removed from Egypt's own memory. His victory stele is 159 lines long. It names every city he took, every king who knelt before him, every ritual purification he performed on the road from Nubia to the Mediterranean. It is one of the most detailed military records from the ancient world. And within 2 centuries of Paye's death, Egyptian historians would write as though he had never existed. Around 728 BCE, the Nubian king Pa swept north from the kingdom of Kush, captured Memphis, Hermopolis, and Thebes, received the submission of 4 regional rulers, and installed himself as pharaoh over the most storied civilization on earth. He performed every correct religious rite. He was buried under a pyramid. The first Egyptian-style royal pyramid built in over 500 years, excavated by George Reisner of the Harvard-Boston expedition in 1918. By every measure of the ancient world, he was legitimate. Yet later, Egyptian king lists compiled under the 26th dynasty and used by Greek historians, including Manetho, either reduce the entire 25th dynasty to a brief footnote or excise it entirely. Egyptologist Timothy Kendall documented that Manetho's chronology, preserved in fragments by Julius Africanus and Eusebius, assigns the Nubian rulers reign lengths contradicted by archaeological evidence. Laszlo Torek, in his 1997 study of the Kingdom of Kush, cataloged 32 temples in Upper Egypt bearing Paye's cartouche that were later defaced or had his name replaced under subsequent dynasties. Herodotus, who interviewed Egyptian priests and whose Egyptian history is otherwise detailed, shows no awareness of a dynasty that ruled all of Egypt for 60 years. Mainstream scholars attribute this to 26th dynasty political bias and Manetho's reliance on sanitized sources. The explanation is plausible, but it doesn't fully account for the completeness of the erasure or for its specific geographic logic. Pa was preserved in Nubian memory. He was removed from Egyptian memory only. Someone decided which audiences needed to forget him. Some researchers ask whether the priestly class, who controlled the king lists, erased Pa not because he lost, but because he won too convincingly and made every native Egyptian ruler before and after him look impure by comparison. From a general erased by the civilization he conquered, we move to a general whose erasure punished everyone who dared to remember him. Li Ling, the general whose memory was made radioactive. In 99 BCE, a Han Dynasty general named Li Ling marched 5,000 infantry into the Gobi Desert to fight a Xiongnu cavalry force that outnumbered him roughly 10-1. He held them for 10 days. When he finally surrendered, Emperor Wu did not mourn him. He executed Li Ling's entire family, struck his name from imperial military records, and when the grand historian Sima Qian argued that the surrender was not cowardice but rational calculation, the emperor had Sima Qian castrated. The primary source is Sima Qian's own Shiji, the records of the grand historian, completed around 94 BCE. His letter to Ren An, preserved in the Han Shu, describes the castration in the first person, one of antiquity's most explicit accounts of the cost of accurate memory. Historian Stephen Duran, analyzing the Shiji in 1995, found 17 passages where Sima Qian uses grammatical indirection when discussing Li Ling, suggesting continued fear of imperial reprisal even after Wu's death. Michael Lowe's biographical dictionary of the former Han period documents that the policy of collective punishment, Zusu, eliminated Li Ling's parents, siblings, wife, and children simultaneously, every living person who might have carried a counter-narrative in their mouths. The mechanism is almost surgical in its completeness. The military records are purged. The family is executed. The historian who objects is mutilated in a way specifically designed to humiliate him into silence. Li Ling's name was only partially restored under Emperor Zhao, decades after Li Ling himself died in Xiongnu territory, but his military record was never reinstated in official annals. The mainstream view holds that Han law classified surrender to barbarians as treason, and the punishment followed procedure. But the Zuzu execution does something law doesn't require. It targets memory itself, eliminating the people who knew the story before it could become one. Some researchers ask whether the obsessiveness of the erasure reveals what the emperor actually feared, not a traitor, but a precedent. Li Ling had done what the emperor's own generals had failed to do, and the empire could not afford for anyone to notice. From a court that punished memory keepers, we move west to an empire whose inscriptions performed a different trick. They kept the timeline intact and deleted the man who interrupted it. Artabanus, the man who killed a king of kings and vanished from stone. He murdered the most powerful man in the world in his own bedchamber, controlled the imperial palace, commanded the royal guard, and ruled the largest empire on earth for somewhere between 7 months and 3 years. Then he disappeared from every Persian inscription ever carved, as though the throne of the Achaemenids passed cleanly from one king to the next without anyone in between. In 465 BCE, Artabanus, commander of Xerxes I's personal bodyguard, the Hazarapatish, assassinated the king of kings and seized effective control of Persia. Ctesias of Cnidus, a Greek physician employed at the Persian court around 400 BCE and therefore as close to a primary source as exists, names Artabanus explicitly as both assassin and subsequent regent. Aristotle, writing independently in his Politics, confirms that Xerxes was killed by his bodyguard commander. Diodorus Siculus gives Artabanus a reign of 7 months. Some Armenian sources preserved by Moses of Corinth extend it to 3 years. Persian royal inscriptions at Persepolis, catalogued exhaustively by Eric Schmidt between 1953 and 1970, moved directly from Xerxes to Artaxerxes I with no administrative gap and no intermediate ruler. Historian Pierre Bryant, in his 2002 study of the Achaemenid Empire, notes that Artaxerxes I's legitimacy narrative required presenting himself as Xerxes' direct and uncontested heir. An interregnum, especially one featuring an assassin on the throne, was structurally incompatible with that story. The mainstream explanation is that Greek sources routinely dramatize Persian palace politics, and Artabanus may never have claimed formal kingship. But Wouter Henkelmann's analysis of the Persepolis fortification tablets in 2008 identified anomalous administrative irregularities around 465 BCE in the ration distribution records, nothing explicit, but a detectable disturbance in the bureaucratic flow. Something happened, and it was smoothed over with a precision that itself required planning. Some historians ask whether Artabanus was erased not by his successor, but by himself. Whether a man sophisticated enough to seize the world's largest empire was also sophisticated enough to govern under a dead king's name until he could not. From an empire that erased the man who took its throne, we cross into the world of a general, known only through his enemy's words. Vercingetorix, known only through his conqueror's pen. He organized a military coalition spanning 30 Gaulish tribes, executed a scorched earth strategy that forced Julius Caesar into the most desperate siege of his career, and surrendered with a theatrical grandeur that Caesar himself preserved in careful detail. The problem is that every word in that last sentence came from Caesar. Vercingetorix left no account of himself. His people left no account of him. He exists entirely because his enemy found him useful to describe. In 52 BCE, Vercingetorix led the Battle of Alesia, a confrontation whose earthworks were confirmed by Michel Rede and Sigmar von Schnerbein's excavations published in 2001, validating 11 Roman miles of double fortification exactly as Caesar described. The siege was real. The near disaster for Rome was real. Caesar's own text, the Bellum Gallicum, records that Vercingetorix's cavalry relief force came close enough to fracture the Roman lines before a countercharge reversed the battle. Caesar kept his prisoner alive for 6 years, displayed him in his Gallic triumph, then had him strangled in the Tullianum prison in 46 BCE. Historian Catherine Welch demonstrated in 1998 that Caesar systematically elevated his most dangerous enemies in the Bellum Gallicum specifically to make his own victories more impressive. The Vercingetorix in those pages is partly a literary construction, serving Caesar's self-glorification. John Coke's work on Celtic culture documents that Gaulish Druids maintained a prohibition on committing political knowledge to writing. So the silence is partially structural, not entirely imposed, but here is what doesn't fit. Within 2 generations, Gaul had adopted Latin literacy extensively. Romanized Gauls were writing administrative texts, legal documents, personal correspondence. Not one of them, in the century following the conquest, wrote a correction to Caesar's account. The silence outlasted the structural excuse. Some historians ask whether Romanized Gaulish elites who needed Roman careers and Roman patronage found it professionally lethal to contradict the founding myth of their own subjugation. The censorship may not have been imposed, it may have been chosen, 1 generation at a time. From the forests of Gaul, we cross the Mediterranean to a civilization whose military records don't exist not because they were censored, but because the building that held them was set deliberately on fire. Hamilcar Barca, the general whose library Rome burned. He spent 9 years building a military empire in Spain, training the officers, forging the supply networks, and laying the financial foundations that would allow his son Hannibal to cross the Alps and bring Rome to the edge of collapse. Every battle order he wrote, every tactical map he drew, every strategic document his campaigns produced was stored in Carthaginian archives. In 146 BCE, Roman soldiers carried them into the street and burned them. Hamilcar Barca commanded Carthaginian forces in Sicily from 247 BCE, maintaining a guerrilla campaign from Mount Eryx for 6 years that Rome, despite numerical superiority, could not dislodge. He then built Carthaginian Spain over 9 years before dying in battle in 228 BCE. Dexter Hoyos, in his 2003 study of Hamilcar's Spanish campaigns, reconstructed roughly 47 distinct events for which Carthaginian primary records almost certainly existed and are now entirely absent. Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century, CE states explicitly that after the fall of Carthage, Rome distributed the city's agricultural texts to African princes but destroyed the military and administrative records. The selection was deliberate. Serge Lancel estimated in his 1995 History of Carthage that the city's administrative archives would have filled multiple warehouses. The burning, not looting, indicates destruction of information rather than acquisition of value. Livy, Rome's greatest historian, introduces Hamilcar through Hannibal's childhood memories. Rome's best source for the man who nearly ended Rome is a son's anecdote. The mainstream account frames this as collateral destruction in a total war. Carthage was razed, everything burned, but Pliny's specificity undermines that. Agricultural knowledge was preserved, military knowledge was targeted. Some researchers ask whether Scipio Aemilianus, who commanded the final assault, kept Polybius as his personal intellectual companion and was himself a student of military history, understood precisely what he was incinerating. Did Rome's most sophisticated general scholar knowingly destroy the operational manual of the only family that had ever come close to ending Rome because some military knowledge is simply too dangerous to let survive in any enemy's hands? From a library burned to prevent memory, we moved to a civilization that kept the record, but edited what the record was allowed to mean. Shang Yu, the man history, almost loved more than the emperor. He stands at a river with 26 men. He has just lost the battle that cost him China. A fisherman offers him a boat to escape back to his home province, to rebuild, to fight again. He refuses. He says he cannot face the 8,000 young men from his homeland who crossed this river with him and never came home. He draws his sword and cuts his own throat. The man who beat him will spend the next 2 centuries making sure no one understands why that moment was so devastating. Xiang Yu was not a rebel. From 206 to 202 BCE, he was the dominant military power in China, holding the title of hegemon king. He defeated the Qin relief army at the Battle of Julu in 207 BCE, then oversaw the execution of over 200,000 Qin soldiers who surrendered in the aftermath, a maneuver that became a foundational example in Chinese military philosophy for 2,000 years. Sima Qian, the grand historian, gave Xiang Yu the Benji treatment in his Shiji, the basic annals format reserved exclusively for emperors. For a man who never officially ruled China, this was a structural act of historical defiance. Scholar David Schaberg, analyzing the Shiji in 2001, demonstrated that Sima Qian's account of Xiang Yu at the Wu River follows a specific literary pattern used to encode moral superiority in defeat. The historian was writing a coded eulogy inside the official record of a dynasty that needed Xiang Yu to be remembered as a brute heaven had abandoned. Han official histories compiled under Emperor Wu reclassified Xiang Yu's victories using a formulaic vocabulary of chaos and tyranny that historian Raph de Crespigny identified as retrospective political construction rather than evidential description. The mainstream view holds that this is standard victor's history. The winning side frames the narrative. But Sima Qian had already been castrated once for defending a general the emperor disliked. That he then wrote a chapter making the dynasty's founder appear to be the lesser man suggests either extraordinary courage or extraordinary calculation. Some historians ask whether the Xiang Yu chapter is not history but a message, buried so deep in the structure of the Shiji that it could only be read by those who already knew what they were looking for. From a historian who encoded defiance into official records, we move west to a city that burned its own past, and then had to invent the name of the man who lit the match. Brennus, Rome's greatest humiliation, had no author. Rome is burning. It is 390 BCE, give or take 3 years, and that uncertainty is itself part of the story. A Gaulish general has just done what no foreign commander will do again for 800 years. He has walked into the city that will one day rule the world, looted its treasury, and collected a ransom in gold from its senate. The Romans will tell this story for centuries. They will remember the sacred geese whose honking warned the guards. They will remember the gold weighed on scales. They will remember the phrase, Vae victis, woe to the conquered. They will not, if they can help it, remember him as a man. Every source for the sack of Rome was written between 200 and 500 years after it happened. Livy, Plutarch, Polybius, and Diodorus Siculus are all working from Greek intermediaries and Roman oral tradition. Because, as Livy himself states explicitly in the 6th book of Ab Urbe Condita, the original Roman records for this period were destroyed in the fire. The man who burned Rome's archives is known to us only because the archives he burned were eventually replaced by Romans reconstructing events from memory. Historian Gary Forsyth, in his 2005 critical history of early Rome, demonstrated that no Roman writer before Fabius Pictor, himself composing around 200 BCE, a century and a half after the sack, had access to documentary evidence for Brennus's campaign. The date of the event remains disputed between 390 and 387 BCE, a 3-year window for one of the most traumatic moments in early Roman history. T.J. Cornell noted that this discrepancy alone indicates the absence of any surviving calendrical record. The famous quotation attributed to Brennus, Vae victis, spoken as he threw his sword onto the ransom scales as a surcharge, has no Gaulish linguistic parallel, and was almost certainly a Roman literary invention, as philological studies of Celtic vocabulary have noted. The mainstream explanation is simple. The fire destroyed the records. There is no censorship, just catastrophic information loss. But the Greek world, which had every reason to document the humiliation of a rising Italian power, also provides only fragmentary and contradictory accounts. Some historians ask whether the poverty of the Brennus record reflects an active Roman cultural choice, a deliberate decision to keep the man who burned Rome vague, brutish, and ultimately nameless, because naming him too precisely would mean acknowledging that someone worth remembering had done it. The nameless Hittite commander at Kadesh II empires, thousands of chariots, the largest recorded chariot battle in history, and both sides are about to claim victory in stone. In 1274 BCE, on the banks of the Orontes River near Kadesh, Egyptian and Hittite forces collided in a battle that produced more surviving documentation than almost any military engagement before the classical era. Those documents name charioteers, shield bearers, individual soldiers who received decorations for valor. They name the Hittite king Muwatalli II, who watched from the far bank. They do not name the field commander who nearly killed Rameses II in his chariot. The Egyptian account survives in 5 separate inscriptions at Abu Simbel, Karnak, Luxor, Abydos, and the Ramesseum, plus the literary poem of Pentar and the administrative bulletin text. Egyptologist Kenneth Kitchen analyzed them collectively in 1982 as a unified propaganda campaign, with Ramesses' personal courage as the central narrative. The poem of Pentar describes the Hittite chariot assault with tactical specificity, noting that Rameses was encircled by approximately 2,500 chariots from the division of Amun. But the Hittite attackers are referred to collectively as the wretched Hittite enemy, no individual commander identified. The Hittite treaty version, the earliest surviving international peace treaty, copies held in Istanbul and Cairo, names 17 Hittite witnesses, including priests, scribes, and administrators. No military officer from the battle 15 years earlier appears among them. Historian Anthony Spallinger, analyzing Kadesh's tactical structure in 2005, argued that the assault's sophistication, a deliberate decoy to draw remesses forward, concealed forces, a timed flanking maneuver, implies a specific identifiable commander whose name was simply excluded from both nations' accounts. The mainstream explanation holds that ancient Near Eastern records credited kings with battlefield outcomes regardless of who actually commanded. Naming subordinate officers was not standard practice. This is a gap in convention, not a gap created by erasure. But Egyptian texts were highly specific when specificity served the story. They named the charioteer beside Ramesses, the soldiers who fought bravely, the officers who failed to come to his aid. The selectivity was operational, not stylistic. Some researchers ask whether both empires had a shared interest in keeping this particular man unnamed, because naming him in Egyptian texts would mean acknowledging that someone nearly killed a living god, and naming him in Hittite texts would mean acknowledging that Muwatalli's greatest tactical achievement was not actually the king's own. 10 generals across 3,000 years and 5 continents, and every erasure follows the same logic. The tools changed. Chisels in Rome, fire in Carthage, castration in China, administrative silence in Persia, the victor's pen in Gaul. But the decision behind each one was structurally identical. Someone won too decisively, threatened the official story too cleanly, or surrendered too beautifully, and the record was adjusted accordingly. Mainstream historians are right that most of these silences have conventional explanations: propaganda, political procedure, information loss in war. But the pattern is harder to dismiss than any individual case. The same choice, made independently across cultures that never spoke to each other, produces the same result. You have just spent time studying the edits. Most people walk past these gaps and see nothing. You recognize them for what they are. Hit subscribe and go to the comments. Which of these erasures do you think was the most deliberate, and why? Make your case. History is not what was carved in stone. It is what was decided before the chisel touched the surface. Somewhere in every archive, there is a gap shaped exactly like a man someone needed you to forget. Subscribe and keep looking.